Good morning and Shabbat Shalom. I'm Rabbi Feinstein, and this is Valley Beth Shalom Torah study for a Shabbos morning. It's certainly good to be with you because of some computer problems, which happen occasionally. Of course, my colleagues, Rabbi Hirsch and Rabbi Gelman, are not able to be with us this morning, but I'm really glad that you're here, and I want to wish you a very, very good Shabbos. Just a reminder that following this Torah study, we have davening services this morning from VBS and a wonderful young man's bar mitzvah. And following that, Rabbi Silverman will have a few thoughts about this week's Torah portion. And this week is a very special Shabbat, the Memorial Day. For many years now at Valley Beth Shalom, we've taken it upon ourselves to honor our veterans. We remember those who were lost to us, and we honor those who are still living with us and honor their service and their self-sacrifice in defense of the things that matter most to us: our safety, our security, our families, our freedom. So this afternoon at 1 o'clock, right here on Facebook, YouTube, you're invited to join Valley Beth Shalom's tribute to our veterans. This year, we're honoring the greatest generation. I have wonderful interviews with 3 veterans who are in their later 90s, but have wonderful stories to tell about their service in the military, their giving to the United States, to their defense of the things that matter, and the values that they hold so very dear. So please join us at 1 o'clock for that program and honor the veterans among us, the veterans of America, veterans of Canada and other countries, and of course the veterans of Israel. Thank you for being with us. It has, of course, been a very difficult week for the Jewish people, a very difficult week for all of us. As the pandemic is beginning to wane just a little bit and we can take our masks off and walk outside, and many of us are vaccinated, thank God. This war in Israel has so hurt us and divided us, and the rise of anti-Semitic events around the country, around the world, just shock us. And it's been a very, very difficult week. And apropos of that, the Torah portion that we're going to read is a difficult Torah portion. This is the third Torah portion in the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, Behaalotcha. And what's going to happen in this Torah portion is that we're going to leave Mount Sinai and begin the journey to the Promised Land. The very first episode in the Torah portion, Behaalotcha, the name of the portion, has to do with the erecting and the lighting of the menorah. In front of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the Ark of God, there was a beautiful golden 7-branch candelabrum that brought light to the whole Mishkan, that represented the light of God, the presence of divinity in this community, and the presence of God in the Mishkan. And today in the Torah portion, Moshe is going to give us the instructions of how it's to be lit. Now, what's wonderful about this particular image is pointed out to me by my dear teacher and friend, Rabbi Gelman, in a brilliant sermon that he gave a few years ago. He noticed that the wording of the beginning of the portion is kind of odd, that it has to do with lighting it from before, in front of it. And from the wording of the Torah portion, Rabbi Gelman came to the rather brilliant insight that this was a 7-branch menorah, a 7-branch candelabrum, but the branches swiveled. And because they swiveled, there are 2 ways to set it up. You can look at it face on and see 7 branches of the candelabrum, which represent the diversity of personalities, the diversity of voices, the diversity of values, the diversity of culture within the human community, and the diversity of character within the Jewish people. But you could also fold the branches lengthwise, and looking at it that way, instead of seeing 7 branches, you see one very, very bright light, as all the lights of the 7 branches combine together to give us one very bright illumination. And that, Rabbi Gelman teaches us, represents unity. The unity of the Jewish people as they cross the desert and begin their trek to the Promised Land. The unity of the Jewish people throughout our generations. The unity of humanity sharing a very, very small planet. And as long as we're at it, the unity of our American community, which is so deeply riven today, so deeply split. We have to recognize, said Rabbi Gelman in his wonderful sermon, that what unites us is so much more important and so much more powerful than what divides us. Certainly, there must always be room for dissenting voices in our communities, room for the prophetic voice that points out our moral failings, room for the critical voice, room for the voice of those who feel left out and victimized. Every community needs to make room for those voices, listen carefully, and embrace those narratives. But if we don't have a narrative that unites us, if we don't hold fast to that which pulls us together as one, then we've lost the whole enterprise. And unfortunately, the more we are riven, the more we are divided, the more we are disjoined, the less of us that there is. And so he calls upon us, Rabbi Gelman does in this wonderful sermon, and it taken on this Torah portion. He says the image of the menorah, particularly as we begin this march to the promised land, the image of the menorah is the image that we must keep in mind. That yes, we can acknowledge the diversity, but we must always celebrate and return to an acknowledgement, a celebration, a sanctification of the unity of our people, our communities, and our world. And that is a very, very important message at this moment. I think many of us are watching the news around the world and we're just shocked at how deeply and bitterly the world seems to have united against Israel in its simple task of defending itself. And certainly there are nuances to that story. There certainly is a question about how Israel should make peace with Palestinians and finally settle that conflict. But one has to recognize simply the self-defense of the state of Israel as a principal obligation of any society. And it's time for the community, Rabbi Gelman reminds us, to come together and to be one in that voice. And I think I agree with him as well. The Torah portion then proceeds to tell us I think, one of the saddest stories in the entire Bible. That is, having given us all of these miscellaneous laws these last 3 weeks, taken a census, talked about what the Kohanim are going to, the Levi'im are going to be bringing, how they're going to be carrying the sacred accoutrements with them through the desert. At the end of chapter 10 in the book of Numbers, we begin the journey. We begin the journey. The journey commences. It's been 2 years and 2 months. I mean, the Torah tells us very clearly, as if you didn't know, part 2 of the story, that it's 2 years and 2 months. And we begin the journey toward the promised land. And then what happens? And then something so disturbing happens. Everything falls apart. The book is called Bamidbar. Now, every book of the Bible takes its name from the first significant word in the very first line. Breshit is the first word of the Bible, and Eilish Shemot B'nai Yisrael, so the book is called Shemot. And Vayikra is the first word of the third book, and Bamidbar is one of the first words of this one. But there's something wonderful about the way that each one of those words actually captures what the book is really about. So Breshit, Genesis, Breshit means in the beginning. Genesis, our origins. It's the story of the origins. It's the origins of humanity and the world. It's the origins of the Jewish people. And more than that, it's the philosophical foundations, the narrative foundations of our Torah, of our culture, of our religious culture. Shemot means names. The book is called Exodus in English because it's about the leaving of Egypt. But in Hebrew, it's better. It's Shemot. Be'elish Shemot B'nai Yisrael. These are the names of the children of Israel. And that's what the book is about. It's about identity. The book of Shemot, the second book of the Torah, is about the 2 principal events that define us: the Exodus from Egypt and our experience of meeting God on Mount Sinai. And these are the 2 events that define our identity as a religious culture. Shemot. The third book is called Leviticus in English, which I always thought was the sequel to Spartacus. But because it's in Hebrew, it was known in the Talmud as Torah HaLevi'im, the Torah of the Levites. So in Latin, it became Leviticus. But the first word is Vayikra. God calls. And that's what the book is about. It is a call to the Jewish people to worship. It is a call to the Jewish people to live a life of holiness, to live up to the standards set by God at Mount Sinai, to be a kingdom of priests and a nation chosen, treasured by God. And that's what the book is about, to answer the call. How shall we live a life, a collective life, and an individual life that answers that call to live a life of holiness and to construct a society which is godly? This book is Bamidbar. Now, in English, it's called Numbers because it begins with a census, but Bamidbar, wonderful name, in the wilderness. It takes place in the wilderness. This is the wilderness of Sinai, because at the very beginning of the book, right here in chapter 10, we leave Sinai, and it's going to tell us the story of the trek from Mount Sinai to the promised land. But it's more than that. This is a portrait of the human wilderness. This is the dark side of the human being. This is a book in which everything falls apart. This is a book filled with screaming and shouting and complaining, and it all falls on Moses. It all falls on Moses. In the course of this book, every relationship will melt in his life, and every loyalty will betray him. His family will betray him. In this Torah portion, his sister Miriam, who saved him and who loved him, begins to kvetch about her sister-in-law, his wife. And his tribe will betray him. The Levites and the Kohanim, the Levites particularly, will betray him when Korach, his cousin, rises up against him. And the people will betray him when he sends spies into the land, and they come back discouraged and discourage the people, and the people refuse to enter the land when they're given it as a gift. And ultimately, even God betrays him. You know, he's told to speak to a rock, but it's the day after his sister died, and he's filled with grief, and he's filled with rage, and he just has one of those days. We all know those days. And he just takes the stick and he wails on that rock. He hits the rock. And God says, because you didn't speak to the rock and didn't do what I tell you, you're not going to go into the land. And I know that feeling. You know that feeling, right? Words don't work sometimes. We're so frustrated, so enraged, so tired, so irritated, so antagonized that words just don't work. Of course he hit the rock. Thank God he didn't hit anybody. He just hit a rock. And for that, you're excluded from the land of Israel? For that, I always, when I get to that chapter, and we will soon in a couple of weeks, I cry. I always think that, wouldn't it be great? God, let him go in. Let him go in anonymously. He'll be one of those old guys on the boardwalk at Tel Aviv. He'll sit, he'll sip coffee, he'll play chess. No one will bother him. But God doesn't let him in. The dream will never be fulfilled. He will bring his children and his children's children to the promised land, to the edge of the land, but he will not step inside. Everything betrays Moses. And you read the book, and it's a book where there's no common direction, no common values, no communication, no unity. This is Rabbi Gelman's sermon. This is Rabbi Gelman's nightmare. What unites us has failed, and what divides us has triumphed. And the picture of the disintegration of a people is what we're left with at the end of the Torah portion, at the end of this book of Bamidbar. Here's the section we're reading today in the Torah. Let me just read it to you so we can sort of savor the texture of this episode. They leave Mount Sinai. They begin the journey into the desert. 3 days. 3 days. And this is chapter 11. The people took to complaining bitterly before the Lord. These are the people who were slaves. Their children were being thrown into the Nile. God saved them. They didn't have to do a damn thing to be saved. God saved them. The Lord heard and was incensed, and God got mad at them. And the riffraff in their midst, they always blame it on the riffraff, asafsuf in Hebrew, the collective, all kinds of people. But it means it's the worst of them. They felt a gluttonous craving, right? Hitavu ta'ava. Hitavu ta'ava in Hebrew means a desire, an uncontrollable physical need. And they wept, and they said, listen to this, if only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we used to eat for free. The Hebrew is lechinam, free, not even discounted, free in Egypt. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. Now our gullets are shriveled. There's nothing at all, nothing but this manna, manna to eat. Nostalgia is a very, very cruel thing, We remember. Wherever you are, it's never as good as where you used to be, right? If you live in if you live in Encino, it was better when we lived in Fairfax. And if you lived in Fairfax, it was better in Boyle Heights. And if you lived in Boyle Heights, it was better when we lived in Brooklyn. And if you lived in Brooklyn, it was better when we lived on the Lower East Side. It's always better where you came from. And there, it was better in the old country. That kind of nostalgia. Remember the leeks and the onions. Remember the chocolate fountain. Remember the midnight buffet in Egypt. You didn't know that Egypt was a cruise ship, but it's an indication. It's a picture of the human being, an ugly picture of the human being. Here is poor Moses. He gives them freedom. He brings them to meet God. He gives them the vision of the sacred society, the just society, and the holy uplifted life. He gives them spiritual truth. And what do they want? Steak, chops, burgers. There's something so profoundly ugly about this. And the question, it bothers me, is like, why? Well, further, why put this story in a book? You know, when my family goes on vacation, we take pictures. In the old days, we used to get them printed, put them in albums. Today, you put them on your screen, but in the old days, we had them on albums, right? And what you'd always do is you'd throw out the pictures where the kids were cross-eyed or making rabbit ears or sticking their tongues out. I want nice pictures. I want the beautiful ones. Why would you collect pictures like this? I think it's quite brilliant. I'll tell you why. Because I think what we're seeing in this Torah portion and in this very ugly picture of the human condition is a warning. You see, the Bible has two different theories of how you save a people. Two different theories about how change happens in history. Two different theories about how redemption comes. The first is the theory represented by the Red Sea. We stood at the Red Sea, and there too we complained, by the way. And Moses said, watch. And God said, hold your arm above the sea, and the sea split, and we walked through. That's an image of apocalyptic redemption. The Big Bang, one great revolutionary event, and all of history is reorganized. All of history is redone. One revolutionary event. Workers of the world unite. All you have to do is lose your chains. One revolutionary event. Power to the people. One revolutionary event, and all of life will be changed. You turn that one screw, turn that one knob, change that one setting, and all of humanity suddenly awakens redeemed. That's one image, and every revolutionary carries that image deep in his heart. I certainly did when I was a kid and had long hair and listened to rock and roll music about power and about change. We believe that we could change the world. And that's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing to have a vision of the way things ought to be and to imagine that all it takes is this one moment and we can make it the way it ought to be. That's a beautiful vision. It's a beautiful enthusiasm. It powers the young to rise up against the old and demand something better in the next generation. Certainly did my generation. But then comes along wise old Bamidbar, an older voice, a sober voice, and says, my children, I don't want to discourage you from your vision. I don't want to rob you of your enthusiasm, your passion for the revolution. I just want you to understand one fact. This is the human material out of which you're going to have to create your new utopia. And the human material out of which you create your utopia doesn't change that quickly. Here is the story of the greatest miracle in all of life, in all of the world history. The sea split and we crossed safely. And then we got to Mount Sinai and God spoke to us directly. And yet we're not the same. You know what's the worst part of the story we just read? When they complain, the exact same story happened before Mount Sinai. Before Mount Sinai, they complained There's nothing to eat. We need food. Egypt was a better place. Now, if you have a complaint, and then you have an apocalypse, and the complaint returns after the apocalypse, what are you being told? That the apocalypse doesn't heal the deep inner need that that complaint represented. There's a deep human need for security, a deep human need for understanding my place in the world. And perhaps the fault here is Moses. Perhaps Moses didn't understand, or maybe it was even God, because God is at fault here too. Didn't understand that if you do redemption for them and don't involve them in the process, that they're never going to feel that that deep need is satisfied. And they're always going to complain and always want to go back to Egypt. They have to participate in their own self-redemption. They have to recreate themselves. But that, says wise old Bamidbar, is a very slow process of change. And so this book takes some time to develop, because that process of changing people so that they can change their society, of changing people so their attitudes change and their values change and what they crave and what they want out of life changes, changing people so their responses to each other changes. That's slow, very slow, deliberate work. And that's the process, says Bamidbar. And the reason why it's here is because Bamidbar says, I don't want you to let go of your passion for the revolution. I don't want you to let go of your passion for change, but I don't want you to be disillusioned. Revolutionaries tend to become very disillusioned when the world just doesn't behave the way that their theory told them it would. And when they become disillusioned, they become bitter and they become angry. And sometimes they become reactionary, and sometimes they become indifferent, and often they become self-destructive. I don't want you to become disillusioned. So understand what you're working with and have patience to let the process develop. And then, well, here's the answer to the story. The fifth book of the Torah. What's the fifth book of the Torah? It's called Deuteronomy in English, which means the second law. In Hebrew, it's called Devarim, which is such a wonderful word. Ve'ela hadarim asher diber Moshe kol bnei Israel. These are the words, they're words. The book of Devarim is the fifth book of the Bible. And what happens in that book? Moses speaks and people listen. Moses teaches and people learn. Moses offers himself and the people are eager to gather in everything he has to say. The book of Bamidbar that we're in now is a book of conflict, of screaming and shouting. There's no unity. There's no integration of purpose. There's no shared direction. There's no shared language. There's no shared values. Words just don't work. But in the book of Devarim, words are what we have. It's all Moses' words, which is ironic, of course, because Moses told God at the burning bush that he was a man of no words. And suddenly, 40 years later, the fellows found words, and beautiful words. The book of Devarim is a book of shared words, shared values, shared direction, shared leadership. What's the most important book, the most important word in the book of Devarim? Shema, listen. Shema Yisrael, listen, Israel. And that's what happens. Finally, they're able to listen. So the Torah's promise to us is you have to cross the midbar. You have to cross the wilderness. You have to deal with the inner chaos of human beings, with the cravings and the needs and the desires and the disintegration of human community. You have to fight your way through that. But if you have the resolution, and if you have the courage to do so, and if you can make it through the midbar, I promise you, you'll get to Devarim. You'll get to a place of shared leadership and shared direction and shared words and shared values and collective listening. And that's what the Torah's promise is. This week, we're going to leave Mount Sinai and begin the journey. It's never easy to leave on a trip, you know. You always forget something. You're always worried about where you're going. you know better where you came from than where you're going. And so there's a great deal of insecurity built into this. So let's pray that the journey is a safe one. And let's see each other next week as we continue this remarkable journey through the book of Bamidbar. I wish you a very, very good Shabbos. Reminding once again that following our Torah study, we have services at Valley Beshalom. Following that is Rabbi Silverman's words of wisdom on this Torah portion. And following that, our celebration of veterans at 1 o'clock. Mincha Marav this evening at 6, and then Havdalah tonight at 9. Minyan tomorrow morning and Monday morning, because it's a holiday, tomorrow and Monday morning at 8:30 in the morning and at 6 o'clock in the evening. Lunch and Learn is on Wednesday afternoon. Summer's coming. There'll be a change in the summer schedule. I'll be telling you about that very soon. But in the meantime, I wish you a very pleasant Memorial Day weekend. Let's give honor to those who've served, and particularly to those who lost their lives in defense of all that was precious to us. I am a grandchild of immigrants to this country. My Zayda came terrified, because in the world he came from, every power in the world was against the Jews. I remember when I used to go for a walk with him and he'd see somebody in a uniform, he'd grab me by the hand and pull me across the street. Didn't matter what it was, policeman, fireman, mailman, plumber. If he saw a uniform, that was bad for the Jews. I enjoy a freedom that no Jewish generation in all the history of the diaspora has ever enjoyed. I have grown up without having to fear a knock at the door in the middle of the night. And I am acutely aware of that. And I'm acutely aware of the men and the women who made sacrifices of the years of their youth, sacrifices of the health and strength of their bodies, and for some, sacrifices of life itself to give me that precious, precious gift. And I thank them for it. I think we all do on this Memorial Day. Have a great holiday weekend. Take good care.